Hello, everyone. Welcome. Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Sampson, and I'm the Vice President of Research at the Institute for Research on Public Policy, or the IRPP. The IRPP is an independent think tank committed to bringing together the worlds of research and public policy to improve the lives of Canadians. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague in a minute, but first I would like to take a moment to recognize and reflect on the fact that I'm joining you from the unceded traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose members we recognize as custodians of these lands in what is now called Ottawa since time immemorial. Please take a moment to reflect on the traditional lands in your region. The IRPP is working to mobilize the knowledge, experiences, and voices of Indigenous peoples through dedicated research, fellowships, and publications related to Indigenous realities and directly involving Indigenous peoples. Our discussion today is about communities, and our analysis identifies 131 Indigenous communities located in areas that are susceptible to the disruption that may come as Canada and the world reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transform energy systems. La session d'aujourd'hui sera en anglais, mais le webinaire est enregistré et nous pouvons fournir une transcription de la session en français. Une version française de la présentation sera également publiée sur le chat. Si quelqu'un souhaite poser une question en français, n'hésite pas à le faire. Toutes les publications de ce projet sont disponibles en français sur notre site irpp.org. There will be a question and answer period following the presentation. You can ask your questions using the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we will likely not be able to answer all questions, but please keep your questions short and we will try to answer as many as possible. If you have any further questions or comments after the webinar, please send them to events@irpp.org. Ricardo will now provide you with an overview of the IRPP's Community Transformations Project, a major research initiative that will involve a number of additional publications over the coming year. You can find all relevant documents and more information about the project on our website at irpp.org/community transformations. Now over to Ricardo Chejfec, our lead data analyst.
Sorry about that. Couldn't find the mute button. Thank you so much, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I trust that you can see my presentation already. If not, someone else will surely let me know. I want to talk to you about the Community Transformations Project, our latest initiative geared towards supporting workers and communities on the road to net zero. It's an ambitious project and one that we've been working on for the past 18 months, thankfully with the help of our partners, the Energy Mix and the Community Data Program, which is part of the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. Last week, we released the first few of many research products to come, including an interactive map of community susceptibility, which I'll largely focus on today, as well as 2 community profiles, 1 policy brief on community economic development. The plan for today. I'll start with some context on the project more broadly. I'll walk you through our approach to measuring community susceptibility. I'll demo the map and walk you through some potential use cases. And then I'll wrap it up with just a brief teaser of the products we published this past week, the community stories and the policy briefs, as well as some next steps before moving into a Q&A. So context. This project really starts with an acknowledgement that efforts to decarbonize, both in Canada but also internationally, are already driving changes in technology, energy, markets, and trade. While there's been some work, there has not yet been a comprehensive analysis of both the potential risk and opportunities for workers and communities across the country. So our goal is to use several different research approaches to clarify the challenges, empower local leaders, and to identify actions that governments can take to build resilience. One of the main reasons why we should care, even as the pace of climate action ebbs and flows, is that there's a growing recognition of the economic consequences of inaction. This figure, for example, from the Network for Greening the Financial Systems, a group of central banks and financial supervisors, shows that the impact of drought, heat waves, floods, and cyclones alone can reach more than 8% of global GDP by 2050. So climate change is unlikely to fall off the global agenda. Another reason is the upwards trajectory of energy transitions investments. While the timing of market changes is less certain in some areas, there are a number of reasons to think that this market will continue to grow. Solar and wind are already cheaper than fossil fuels in some cases, and the cost of EVs and batteries are also falling. Developing some of these technologies will take time, certainly, but factors like cost, convenience, and sustainability will also influence their demand. And our third and last reason is that the nature of our country's exports is such that our economy is particularly exposed to the changes that could happen globally, whether it's oil and gas, vehicles and parts, iron and steel, steel and aluminum, chemicals or forestry products. Many of our most exported commodities are highly exposed to the global transition. So being prepared is critical for Canada. And this might ring especially true now, since some of these industries are also the most exposed to the tariffs that the US is currently contemplating. So, to inform this conversation and help communities and governments prepare for what may come, we decided to approach this question through a number of few different angles. We have an interactive map that identifies communities that are susceptible to workforce disruption. We're working on 10 community profiles that rely on local interviews to provide on-the-ground perspective. We have a series of policy briefs that will provide evidence-based policy recommendations to government, and later in the year, we'll also have in-depth studies on a number of topics written by experts. So let's talk about our approach. By community susceptibility, we mean the potential for workforce disruption. Disruption could involve job change, new skills needs, potential inflows or outflows of workers, adjustment to earnings, and in some cases, unemployment. But the disruption that we care about is not necessarily negative and has the potential to benefit the community in the long run, especially if we can anticipate and properly manage those changes. And while a lot of the work is focused on what we call the direct transition risk, that is the company and workers most likely to be impacted, our decision to focus on entire communities is intended to capture the indirect transition risk, the cascading impacts to contractors, suppliers, services, local governments, and residents more broadly. This is particularly important in smaller communities with lower levels of economic diversity and high concentrations of employment in susceptible sectors, which informed our methodology. So to measure susceptibility, we selected 3 different metrics. We didn't want to have a black box index that obscured why a certain community might have been identified as susceptible. And all of the data that we use is publicly available and updated on a regular basis, meaning it can be replicated and tracked over time. These 3 metrics were selected because they roughly match onto what we think are some of the 3 biggest measurable challenges communities are facing. Our first indicator, facility susceptibility, looks at emissions from large facilities relative to the size of the community. Here you can think, for example, of a large manufacturing facility in a relatively small community, where it may be both a large source of emissions and economic activity. Our second metric is intensity susceptibility, which looks at the proportion of employment in emissions-intensive sectors. Intensity here is a measure of emissions adjusted for the value added of the sector. And in this indicator, we see communities with a lot of employment in various emissions-intensive sectors, mostly manufacturing and transportation. Our last indicator is market susceptibility, which looks at the proportion of employment in globally traded sectors, expected to undergo major market transformations. Here, we look globally at different scenarios over the coming decades with different levels of climate action. And we identified 6 sectors or industries that are likely to undergo major market transformations across all of those scenarios. You'll notice that none of these metrics are tied to a particular policy pathway. This ensures its usefulness as plans change, but it doesn't tell us much about the distinct timing of transformations across industries. Similarly, employment counts, which is the basis for all 3 indicators, come from Census 2021, which obscures changes that happened before or after that date. We'll be working on addressing both of these challenges throughout the year. Here you can see a summary of our results. Every circle in this figure is a census division or proxy for communities. We chose census divisions because they are sufficiently large and they cover the entirety of the country. But they may not always be what people think of communities on the ground. In Southern Ontario, they align fairly well with what we think of as counties, making them great stand-ins for communities. But in northern and more remote parts and in some other provinces, they tend to be quite large geographically, still have small populations, and not necessarily aligned with the delineations that people think of on the ground. However, our methodology can be applied to any census geographical category. Back to the infographic, all 293 census divisions in Canada are depicted in this bar. As you can see, we've grouped them. The size of the circle represents the size of the community in terms of its workforce. And as you can see, we've divided them into 5 different groups or degrees of susceptibility. At the very top, we find those in the category most susceptible, which are there because they score in the top 2% of communities in at least one of the 3 metrics I just described. Those in the more category score in the top 5% in at least one of the 3 metrics, and those in the moderately susceptible category in the top 10%. Altogether, there's 68 communities in these 3 categories, which we refer to as susceptible communities. And when we dig a little bit deeper, we find that on average, they tend to be smaller, more remote, and less economically diverse. And together, they house roughly 10% of the Canadian workforce. We can dig into each of the metrics a little bit before we get to the demo. Starting with facility susceptibility, on the screen you can see a screenshot pulled straight from our map on the left. At least I think it's your left. And on the right, some additional information regarding the number of susceptible communities, the share of Canada's workforce in those communities, as well as a list of susceptible of as well as a list of the industries responsible for the scores of those susceptible communities. In 2021, fossil fuel electric power generation and oil and gas extraction topped the list of largest emitters, which is why we see so many susceptible communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but to some extent also in BC and in Atlantic Canada. Across this metric, we also see some susceptible communities in Ontario and Quebec, but these are largely associated with employment in high emissions manufacturing and mining. The intensity susceptibility metric looks fairly different, with many of the susceptible communities shifting east. Here we see a lot of relatively smaller communities with large concentrations of employment in various types of emission-intensive sectors, often combinations of different types of manufacturing like food, wood, and metals, with some type of transportation like truck or water. Important to note that due to data limitations, this indicator excludes employment in farms. And since some types of crop and animal production are fairly emissions intensive, this is an obvious limitation that we're working hard to address in future iterations. And here we have our last metric, market susceptibility. In the bottom, right here, you can see the 6 industries we selected. We still see some fossil fuel industries like oil and gas extraction, support activities for mining. Let me switch to the laser. In oil and gas extraction, petroleum and coal product manufacturing, coal mining, and support activities for mining and oil and gas extraction. And that's why we still see a lot of the same communities in the West. But we're also including transportation equipment manufacturing and chemical manufacturing, which are much more prevalent in Southern Ontario and to some extent parts of Quebec. This metric is particularly useful for these 2 last industries since their emission levels do not necessarily align with their expected transformation. Yet, we've seen the transformation happening around EVs, and we know that chemicals will also play a huge role in a number of different industries. And I mentioned that we didn't want a black box index, so we didn't combine our 3 susceptibility metrics into one last one. What we do instead is we create this 4th metric called top score, in which for each community we select the highest or most susceptible group across the 3 metrics. The advantage of this view is that it gives a snapshot of the most susceptible communities without assumptions about the relative impact of each challenge. So I'm going to stop sharing here and switch to the actual map. If you just give me 1 second. Almost there. Perfect. So this is a version of the map pulled straight out of our website, built by our great partners at the CDP, at the Community Data Program. Before I get into some use cases, let me show you the various components. So over here, you'll see obviously a map of Canada split by census division and colored according to our susceptibility groups. Up here in the control panel, you'll find the legend for susceptibility groups, as well as some filtering options. You can filter by our metric, or you can filter by province and territory. Down here in this panel, you'll be able to see additional information about a community you select. By default, this panel is always pointing to a community, and it won't change until you actually go and click on a different census division. Whenever you're working on this map, it would be a good idea to ensure that the name on this panel matches the name of the census division that you are working with. Apart from that, it'll also show information across the different susceptibility scores as well as their sources. Down here, we have additional information about the community selected as well. But here we're focused on demographic information from the census. On the left, you see whatever community you select, and on the right, you'll see a benchmark comparison. In this case, we've chosen the corresponding province or territory. So if I go and I click on another census division, you'll see this update to division number 19 in Manitoba and to the profile of Manitoba. I'll come back to this in a second, but let me go over a couple of use cases. Actually, before that, I'll point out that one of the biggest advantages of the dashboard is that almost everything is hoverable. So if you're unsure about something and you want to learn more, hover your mouse over census divisions, over information icons, over particular buttons or messages, and you'll find out more. If it still isn't clear, I'll point you towards a technical document that is housed in our website next to this map, as well as our methodology document for more information about how we actually came up with it. But let's do some role playing. Let's pretend that I work for the government of Saskatchewan and I'm interested to see how the province performs altogether. So the first thing I would do is I would filter into the province and I would make sure to select the top score. This one will give me a summary of all the other metrics, and I can see that across the province there are susceptible communities in the southern border and in the western border. But maybe I want to dig a little deeper and I want to know why. So if I click on facility susceptibility and filter only by that metric, we see that the most susceptible communities are indeed here in the southern border. If I move on to the intensity susceptibility, I see that there's practically no susceptible communities in Saskatchewan according to intensity susceptibility, but this of course would look very different if it included agriculture or farms. And lastly, if we go to market susceptibility, we see that there are perhaps more susceptible communities on the western coast. This type of exercise, of course, can be repeated at the federal level or on any other province or territory. But I think this map really shines when we are interested into digging really deep into a single community. So let's now pretend that I'm part of a community economic development council in Sault Ste. Marie. So what I would do first is I would filter by Ontario, which by the way, if you're having trouble with lag or the speed of the map, filtering by a province or territory should greatly help. But if I were to search Sault Ste. Marie here, I wouldn't find it because that's the name of a municipality, and our search works on census divisions. Luckily, you can click on these three arrows over here to pull up a nice search helper. And if I search Sault Ste. Marie here and press enter, it'll tell me that Sault Ste. Marie is in Ontario and is in the census division of Algoma, 3557. So I can now close this and go back into here, and I could search for Algoma, or I could search for 3557. Once you click on it, it's going to highlight it, but it's not going to select it. You can see that it still says division number 18, Saskatchewan. So if I go ahead and click on it, I can learn more about that community. The first thing that I see is that the top score tells me that it is more susceptible. And if I look at the three different metrics, I can see that it is more susceptible in intensity susceptibility. So if I click on that metric, it's going to tell me why it is susceptible according to this metric. And we find out that it is because 5.1% of the labor force is employed in iron and steel manufacturing, and another 1.5% in wood manufacturing. There's some employment in water, sewage, and other system, which is fairly emissions intensive, but it's fairly small, so we don't really have to worry about it in this case. We can dig even a little bit deeper if we go down here into our demographics. First, we can see that Algoma has roughly 50,000 workers in 2021 compared to the 7.4 million, excuse me, of Ontario in 2021. We can look at their age distribution and they look fairly similar. In terms of the highest level of education, we see slightly lower rates of bachelor degree or slightly lower rates of workers with a bachelor's degree or higher. And if we look at the tier occupation categories, which if you're not sure what you are, you can click on this information button and you'll find out that they correspond to the type and or amount of training, education experience, and responsibility typically required to work in an occupation. And they go from tier 5, which is no education, no formal educational requirements, to tier 0, which is management duties in general. And as you can see, we see a slightly larger share of workers in tier 3 and 2. We can go even deeper. So we know that the source of susceptibility here is metals manufacturing. So we can try to filter this profile by that industry as well. If I go in here, I don't see any metals manufacturing here. So instead, I'll click on the information button above it. And if I just make the sharing screen a little bit bigger, you can see that 331, which is the parent NICS code for metals manufacturing, is part of heavy industry. So I can come down here, click on heavy industry, and get the specific demographic distribution for this portion of the labor force. We can see that there's roughly 4,000 workers in Algoma in heavy industry, a little bit more than the 5.1% only in iron and steel, meaning this includes probably a couple other industries. But it's largely iron and steel. And when we look at the distribution, we see that in general, they're a little bit more likely to be between 25 and 64 years old. They have significantly higher rates of college apprenticeship or other non-university certificates. And when we look at the tiers, they are also significantly overrepresented in tier 3 and 2, which is equivalent to post-secondary education or apprenticeship. This might not be super surprising in this case, but it can be really useful to develop very specific economic development plans or to get a handle on the situation in a particular community. I will stop sharing again. Give me 1 second and try to come back. Great. So I hope that was helpful. And if you do have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. One of our colleagues is happy to answer or reach out to us afterwards. If you've already visited the map and instead you want a description or more information of all communities, or if you'd want to replicate or build on our work, please visit the data downloads portion of our site where you'll find a number of useful spreadsheets. But I also promised a quick teaser of the products we published last week, including the profiles and the policy brief. So let's get to it. The idea behind the profiles is to complement the data-heavy nature of the map. So we selected 10 communities to profile through a series of interviews with people who live and work in the community, with the help of our partner, the Energy Mix. Most of the communities selected are located in the most susceptible communities, but others were chosen because of anticipated developments or because they have interesting stories to tell. The profiles are meant to cover a diversity of regions and types of economic activity, and they should provide additional information into the challenges and opportunities the communities face, and hopefully reflect the perspectives of residents. The first two community profiles are out, focusing on Estevan, Saskatchewan, and Ingersoll, Ontario. In Estevan, the energy mix met with a lot of local stakeholders, including the mayor's office and the Chamber of Commerce. Back in November, my colleague Rachel also visited the community and spoke to people on the ground like the local United Way. As one of the most susceptible communities due to high levels of employment in coal power, coal mining, and oil and gas production, there's a lot of concern around the coal phase-out and volatility of oil and gas markets. Ultimately, what we heard is that they're looking for more control and agency over the planning and government investments, and that they are optimistic about emerging opportunities like SMRs, geothermal, and solar. Ingersoll, Ontario, on the other hand, is one of the first communities to shift from traditional automaking into EV assembly, with the General Motors CAMI plant, which now produces or assembles BrightDrop's electric vans. My colleague Rosanna and I had the pleasure of visiting the community and touring the CAMI plant back in December and got to hear directly from plant workers about the challenges during the transition period. Contract negotiations, supply chain issues, and the retooling of the factory kept the plant virtually inoperative for a number of years. Now that they are back, automation has reduced the size of the workforce and changed some skills needed. And a slow buildup of demand for the EV vans assembled here means they're still not operating at full capacity. What we heard is that the transition period was felt across the community, leading to the closure of some parts suppliers and increased the need of various social services. Local leaders asked for better community social services, more government support to EVs, and improved training and education services. And so based on this analysis, as well as other past and ongoing research here at the IRPP, we developed a set of initial recommendations for governments. Our first set of recommendations focuses on local economic development, but future recommendations will look at things like skills and training, employment insurance and social services, and ways to support major employers in the community. But regarding specifically or brief on community economic development, we have three recommendations. Number one, to enhance incentives for private investment in susceptible communities. This could be in the form of enhanced tax credits or subsidies meant to increase communities' economic diversity. Recommendation number two has to do with empowering local strategic development planning. Take, for example, the federally funded community futures organizations, which are particularly well poised to develop and deliver bottom-up community-led programming. And our third recommendation is to establish a Canadian Centre for Community Transformation. This would be a centralized information hub for sharing things like data, case studies, and best practices between communities that are likely going through similar challenges. As you can tell, we'll have a busy year coming. So in January, we published, like I said, the map, the methodology, an infographic that you saw previously in the slide, the profiles for Estevan and Ingersoll, and a policy brief on a community economic development. Barring a federal election or any other thing that could potentially change our schedule, we plan to publish 3 other profiles between March and April, as well as another policy brief. Another 3 profiles and 2 policy briefs between April and May, and the 2 last profiles, another policy brief, and 1 summary report, summer of this year. Later into the fall of 2025 and through the next year, we'll be publishing expert-led studies on things like skills matching, place-based policy approaches, and individual learning accounts, which we're really excited to share with you. That's all for me. Thank you everyone for coming and for listening. A huge thank you to our partners, authors, and advisors as well, without whom none of this would have been possible. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and to answer any questions you may have.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A there, Ricardo, one of which should be great for you to answer on the data side for labor data.
Sure, let me take a look.
It says ask if
Yeah,
it's delineated between contract workers and direct employees.
we look at the total number of people on the labor force, which means age 15 and over and in private households, either employed or unemployed, which would cover the majority of contract workers. But we haven't really done a distinction between, we haven't really looked at ties to specific employment counts by firm or the types of workers that they employ.
So if they're self-employed in that sector, they would be counted as working in that sector.
Correct.
Yeah.
I see another question about agriculture and farming. It says, why was agriculture and farming left out, and how will this be remedied? It's a great question. Our biggest challenge is census data, which groups together animal and crop production. The emissions intensity of animal and crop production are already very different. And when we look at specific commodities between those two sectors, the discrepancy grows even higher. Including it without additional data would probably overestimate the susceptibility of some communities and underestimate the susceptibility of others, which is the reason why we chose to keep it out. Our plan is to keep looking for other data sources where we can tie more closely the emissions intensity of particular commodities and regions in order to repeat this exercise with those industries in particular.
Right, and just the question on the presentation, we're happy to share the presentation, both English and French. Ricardo, there was another question that I answered in writing, but it might be helpful to talk about it a little bit. So it is about how the US tariffs will impact some of the communities we identified as susceptible. So I said that a lot of the same communities would be affected, given that many of the susceptible sectors are major exporters, but maybe you can say a bit more on that.
No, I think that's a great response. What the interesting thing about the threat of tariffs is that it hits across two challenges. It's not only the market transformation one, which obviously pre-selects highly trade exposed industries, which are also large components of our export to the US, but also, like Rachel mentioned, a lot of our emission intensive industries, specifically various types of manufacturing, which are the ones that are especially lighting up in our emissions intensity metric, are also vulnerable to the tariffs. So I think there are a great deal of complements to be looked into there.
There's another question about, do we have a list of the 68 communities available? So it might be worth pointing to some of those additional products.
Yes, if you go to the data sources, the project data portion of the map, which my colleague Abigail just put in the chat, there's two spreadsheets available there. The first one is just an overview of all 292 communities by susceptibility score. So if you filter those by most, more, and moderately, you'll find those 68. It contains a lot of information about the census division, including the largest census subdivision, population, labor force, as well as change since 2016, the sources of susceptibility, levels of employment or emissions in those sources, as well as the number of businesses and large businesses in those industries in that census division, which I think it's an excellent resource. I would point people there if you want to learn more. The other file that's in there as well is one more geared towards other researchers who would like to do their own calculations based on the numbers we've produced. So it's a much simpler database meant for statistical programs with or score for all the communities as well as the groups that we've assigned to them. You can also find our data sources there if you want to learn more.
Yeah, and I think if they're trying to do something with the data, they have questions, they can just reach out to, community transformations at irpp.org, right?
Yeah, please do. That'd be fantastic. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help any way we can.
There's another question about the recommendations and how well they match with what communities recommend.
Well, I would say they match very well because they've been informed by what we've been hearing in the communities in part. As part of this process, we've done we've tried to tackle it from every angle. Like I said, we've reviewed as much of the literature as we've could over the past 18 months. We've talked to experts and we've talked to a lot of government offices and people, as well as going to the individual communities. Um, I would say that cases where it doesn't align are cases that we should probably look back into because that's not what we intend. Would you agree, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, given that one of our key recommendations is to listen more to the communities and develop community-led strategies, I think most communities, all that we've spoken to, have agreed with that and really want to have more agency and say in what's happening in their community and really have it led from the bottom up as opposed to top down. There's a question too about how municipalities could use it, potentially the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and what sort of engagement we've done with communities in general. So I don't know, Ricardo, you want to talk about the CDP and what we've done with them?
The
In terms of like we participated in webinar with
Oh,
the
right.
community data program and spoke with some of the communities there.
Yeah, well, a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past, I would say, 6 months of our work was to get the word out and to get as much feedback on the product as we could. Like I said, we spoke to federal government departments, but also provincial and in some cases municipal agencies like community futures organizations. We also, the community data program, one of our partners, they themselves have member municipalities which they help access and work with data. And it's been a great opportunity for us to reach out directly to those people working at the local level, using data to shape policy making.
We briefed FCM as well. So FCM, some folks there are aware of the work that we've been doing. So I've seen that a number of them have downloaded as well in terms of people reaching out with interest.
And we'll be happy to reach out again, right? Part of the big push that we have left throughout this year is to make sure that everyone knows about it and everyone can use it. So I think great question.
So another question about the timeframes. Have communities when are they expected to experience impacts?
Well, it varies, right? There's some communities like Ingersoll project that are actively already transforming at least some of its industries. There's not only the Kami plant, but also a nearby Toyota plant, and the region as a whole has produced a number of announcements and I think excitement for this new industry. Similarly, I mentioned Sault Ste. Marie. Algoma Steel there is actively trying to decarbonize its steelmaking process, which will have implications for its workforce. But I think we know that the timeline is a bit more uncertain for other industries, like oil and gas or oil and gas to some extent, chemical manufacturing. Those we'll have to take case by case, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we didn't include timeframes in the analysis is because of the assumptions it would require about the policy mix that's in place in Canada, international policy. And so what we wanted to have was something that was it's more of a stress test of the susceptibilities in Canada rather than sort of predicting the future and what will happen and when I mean, that layer can certainly be added on things with looking at different trends. And there's some of that in the methodology paper when you look at the market susceptibility metric. There's some of that analysis in there, but that's sort of something additional can be done kind of by product, by sector type of thing, even considering the specifics of a local facility and how they're positioned within the context of market change, et cetera.
And every year we learn a little bit more. And one of the biggest advantage of this methodology is that we'll be able to update it fully when the next census come out, which hopefully will also update our projections for the market transformation sectors.
There's a question about case studies from other jurisdictions. And some of the, I think in the brief, we talk about the US and, some things happening in Australia as well. So maybe it's worth mentioning some of those.
Yeah, well, this project really started with an international sort of environmental review of just transition. We looked, this almost 2 years ago, at cases in Germany, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, and more recently, like Rachel has learned. There's a number of lessons to be learned from it. I don't know if you wanted to speak more specifically about any of them.
Yeah, in our so in the policy brief, which the first one that we've done focuses on community economic development. So we point to the approach taken in the US under the Inflation Reduction Act, where they identified energy communities, which their methodology, there's pros and cons to it, but they initially focus on sort of coal transition communities and the periphery around them. And what they did is they provided a top up to some of the tax credits included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So one of our recommendations is actually look at doing a similar thing in Canada for these susceptible communities. So providing that top up to, whether it's a tax credit or whether it's an existing program that's providing incentives for investment, that you can consider providing a little added incentive for private investment in an identified susceptible community. And we also point to some of the stuff, the Australia has this net zero economy authority that's really having sort of the whole of government approach to helping support some of these communities undergoing transformations, considering not just the economic development side, but other aspects as well in terms of training. So there are some really interesting models happening around the world, and future policy briefs are going to be looking more at those international examples.
On that same note, Rachel, there's a question about engaging with local post-secondary institutions when doing this research. They ask, what role would you see for educators in putting their community's recommendation into place?
Well, I think stay tuned. We have spoken to a number of post-secondary institutions as part of, particularly in terms of the profiles. But our next policy brief is going to be looking at workers, skills, training, those types of questions. And so as part of that, we're engaging more with colleges, going to be speaking to a number of post-secondary institutions and people with expertise in that area. And so our next set of recommendations is really going to be looking at that. So if anyone has expertise in that area or experience and wants to chat about it with us, we'd be happy to do that.
And I guess if it wasn't clear from the presentation, we do see our recommendations to fall into kind of 4 major categories: community economic development, social supports, supporting major employers, and skills and training. And that in the skills and training, I think so to answer your question, I think they'll play a very big role. And that's exactly what we'll be chatting with them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things I found about the Ingersoll profile was, on the surface, people would say, oh, well, they have this investment in EVs and battery manufacturing. And so maybe that the role of governments is done there. But I think what came out a lot in that profile was that people did not feel supported enough in terms of both on the training side of things, but the social supports in particular, the employment insurance system, was not geared towards workers that were experiencing rolling layoffs, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off kind of thing, or temporary shutdowns when there were supply chain shortages, those types of things. So, that's one of the areas we're going to be looking at is employment insurance and some of the social support systems that are in place when communities are undergoing major transformations. Ricardo, there's a question that I answered that may be worth talking about too, in terms of how people can use the map. Um, whether it's useful in identifying potential economic development opportunities, and also associated with climate change and adaptation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the climate change and adaptation is an interesting dimension. There's one of the things that I guess doesn't answer the question, but I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to still say, is that there is so much we could fit in this map, right? There are so many lenses in which we could try to see susceptibility or this concept of susceptibility, both in the context of decarbonization and outside of it. There are industries that are going to be more impacted by the consequences of climate change, for example, which are not currently captured as particular sources of susceptibility. And there are also other economic conditions about specific communities that may modulate how exposed or how well they can react to these to this particular impacts. So I think as it works now, the map is best used as a way to understanding what I like to think of as the exposure side of the question of communities. Not necessarily how well equipped they are to respond, but how exposed they'll be to the challenges specific to this decarbonization question that we've been talking about. So that could serve, I think, a lot of uses. Economic development is one of them. Training and skills needs is another one. I guess it boils down to helping choose the right policy mix, right? And we will certainly have much more to say on that later on. I see a question that just came in that I think might be an interesting one to end on. They ask, are there any places, gaps where you see potential for additional census data being collected in 2026? Well, I think from my end, I'll let you, Rachel, answer as well. But from my point of view, the most obvious ones would be farms employment. It's a huge gap. It's highly concentrated. It makes up very significant portions of certain communities in some parts of the country. And I think that data would not only benefit us, but benefit a lot of other researchers looking at it. There are similar problems with some other smaller sectors for which some variation would be helpful, like when it comes down to utilities, but I think those details are too minor. Outside of that, I think the data that we're looking for would exist outside of the census. We'd love to have more detailed emissions intensity data by industry, by sub-industries, as region, as specific as we could get it, is the most helpful that it could be. Yeah.
And one of the recommendations that we do make is establishing a federal center for community transformation that would, gather all of the community level information, provide user-friendly data, help share case studies, so the communities on one side of the country can learn from the experience of the other. So hopefully something like that might exist that could draw on census data, but make it more user-friendly for people working in the community. So with that, I think we've answered most of the questions, but please do feel free to reach out if you have more. communitytransformations@irpp.org. Et si vous souhaitez obtenir une copie de la transcription de la discussion traduite en français, veuillez envoyer un courriel à events@irpp.org. We will also be sharing a video of the webinar on our website at a later date. And finally, a reminder that all our publications are available in English and French on our website at irpp.org/community transformations. And as we've mentioned, we will have more publications coming out as part of the project over the coming year. Thanks again to everyone for participating, and thanks to the McConnell Foundation and Vancity for their support of the initiative, and to Ricardo and the rest of the IRPP team for pulling the event together. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.